Welcome back for the second installment of my somewhat basic overview of the Astartes, the legendary elite warriors of the Imperium, the Space Marines. This series is an overview more than a deep dive, so we're getting a feel for the chapter's history from their inception to M41. Today we're overviewing what I refer to as the core progenitor chapters. These are the remaining 4 Loyalist First Founding chapters to cover, as last time we looked at the more troubled or damaged First Founding chapters, who have through one issue and another suffered greatly since their inception. And remembering of course that a progenitor or a First Founding chapter are those who retain the name of the original Legion since they were founded with their Trademarks. It should be noted that the Imperial Fists have also suffered greatly, but they do not bear as severe genetic scars as, say, the Blood Angels. Now, I started this series to look at the overall background, history and key differences between the Space Marine chapters. For one, because it's been requested a lot, but also, as I noted previously, attempting to tackle the Astartes as a subject matter, it always felt like this sheer rock face of lore, which upon attempting to scale became difficult to know even where to start, let alone navigate. The first episode of this series really helped me, and I think we will undoubtedly continue on into the Traitor Legions, and from there spur into some specific deep dives for chapters, Trademarks individually and so forth, looking at more key questions, underlying principles and speculations. Hopefully, no matter if you're just starting your 40k journey or you're a long-time veteran, this remains an enjoyable ongoing series because, as I always say, I do believe it's helpful to periodically strengthen the outline of base concepts, bring back into more colour general things that we understand about the 40k verse. Not least because it's very easy to become wrapped up in the conceptual details and inordinately specific threads, something that I surely know all too well. So sometimes taking a step back for a reset can be beneficial to maintain focus on what is otherwise an immensely deep and complex world. We will touch on today also a few details in the next section about the Astartes creation, general principles, things like this, just to build a complete picture. So let's get on and do that. Or, of course, if you're here for the Loot and Sleep Club, this is fine also. So, last time I covered, as we should, the origins of the Astartes, how they were developed, how they were created, their role in the reunification of humanity throughout the galaxy, and their ignominious rebellion that brought humanity from a position of new power and glorious ascent to the brink of complete destruction and effectively extermination from the galaxy. We also looked at the foundings made since that time, the second, the Ultima foundings, and how they forged the future for the Astartes and the Imperium. Something that was more talked around than addressed specifically, but that I feel is really fundamental to understand about the Space Marines, the Astartes, is their position in the galaxy in terms of scale. For several reasons, one being that just the general interest in understanding how few Astartes there actually are, but secondly, from a narrative point of view, it's helpful and interesting to relate how different factions of the 40k verse are presented to us, because presentation does not always align with the fictional reality of the Imperium. The recent exploration of the Iron Snakes chapter and their number deployed to Naxos is but one example. More notable entries could be Uriel Ventress being deployed with a small contingent of Astartes to Pavonis, or the Imperial Fists Captain Lysander's arrival at Opus. The list goes on and on. The point is, the scale of battles seen during the Heresy, or that occur at pivotal events such as the Fall of Cadia, the Battle for Vigilus, which may see many Astartes chapters collectively fight upon a world, are generally less common. Because Space Marines are fundamentally shock troops, they're not battle line infantry. The Ultramarines quotation I used last time remains true. To take a town, send a legionary. To take a city, send a squad. To take a world, send a company. To take a culture, send a chapter. However, the description of sending an entire company of Astartes to take a world is actually quite generous. A company of Astartes is generally 100 Marines. Anybody who knows the lore and stories of the 40k verse will tell you that that is a chunk of Space Marines to arrive on a world. Very often, we're used to seeing single squads or a couple of squads or even less arriving at a planet to deal with whatever troubles they may be having. Only in the very worst of scenarios do they end up being bolstered by significant reinforcements. which may not even be the Astartes themselves. It could be Sororitas, specialist Imperial Guard deployments led by an Inquisitor, Imperial Knights Mechanicus, and so on. So to circle back, the point overall is that very often our perspective of just how many Astartes are out there and being deployed to engagements is often unclear or distorted by how the 40k verse is presented, quite simply because the Space Marines are the most visible part of it. And if you're a tabletop player as well as enjoying the lore, it's very easy to forget that your huge Space Marine force is not necessarily the most common or even accurate representation of how Space Marines are deployed. It's a sliding scale, of course, because while it may make no sense to send only a couple of Marines to a world besieged by chaos or alien horrors, very often that is still exactly what happens. But if there are the resources available, very obviously they will deploy more, which is of course the entire point. In the galaxy of M41, the Space Marines have to carefully deploy and manage themselves to be where they are needed most. For it is said that even if every chapter of Astartes were operating at full strength, something which is rarely if ever true due to the constant attrition of war, they would still only number enough to spare one Marine per Imperial planet in the galaxy. Over millennia, their numbers have fluctuated severely. Some chapters have been extinguished forever, their tales of glory and sacrifice buried beneath stacks of vellum and parchment in archived vaults, with records that were placed there many millennia previous. All that documentation is steadily rotting down through the unstoppable forces of entropy. This constant weathering of the Astartes is what necessitates the various foundings that have taken place over millennia, the continual recruitment that occurs and continues to do so throughout the contemporary Imperium. Unlike so many Imperial worlds, which are frozen wastes, destroyed ecosystems, or planets struggling with innumerable factors which limit their viability as a habitable world, there exist throughout the galaxy many worlds which contain stunning environments, lush forests, endless horizons of mountains and crystal azure lakes. Some of these verdant planets are known as paradise worlds, and they often are claimed as planets to be enjoyed as a luxury for the nobility or the higher classes who rule hive worlds within their system. Some of these planets may have been crafted and seeded many thousands if not hundreds of thousands of years ago by the Eldari, which can bring them then into positions of conflict when they return to discover that they are now inhabited by humans, and sometimes these planets could even contain the buried tombs of the Necrontyr. There are other planets though which are simply lucky enough to be naturally beautiful, untouched examples of the power of the natural world, but who are also home to a human civilization. The White Scar's home planet of Chagoris is one such world. Azure skies, hypnotic sweeping grass plains that cover as much as half the planet. Most impressive are the vast mountain ranges that dominate the landscape. The world lies in the Ultima Segmentum and has two moons known as Blue Hawk and Silver Eagle. As is often the case, planets such as these that have not suffered the total ecological collapse often seen on hive worlds are designated as feudal or feral worlds. Sometimes these are also night worlds, for they have seen far less industrialization, and this has enabled them to retain a planet's natural environment, something that it will then become later treasured for in the Imperium, very often a jewel in the crown of a system. Chagoris has managed to retain its beauty while still seeing necessary expansion of technology and cities upon the world. And this remains a critical aspect of protecting the planet for the White Scars. And so while there exist cities upon the world, the vast majority of its population exist as nomadic tribes who wander the wilderness and range in size from a few hundred to even 10,000. For as beautiful as the planet is, it remains a harsh environment that is very unforgiving and leads its people to become tempered by the conditions thrown against them. Extreme seasonal temperatures and storms which thrash the planet with howling winds that cut through the unprotected like shards of glass. The tribes here exist in a state of continual flux, which means moving around and competing for resources and inevitably some conflict. The tribes of Chagoris are by their nature in a state of permanent feral poverty. They live hunter-gatherer lives of subsistence, and wealth has little place or means to exist beyond livestock and whatever can be carried with them. So individual reputation among one's tribe and to others is one of the most valuable resources to those in the nomad tribes. The Primarch of the White Scars is one Jagati Khan, otherwise known as the Great Khan or the Warhawk. He would become known for traits which included a quiet, more isolated nature and a fierce drive should it be warranted. Even his brother Primarchs understood little of him, and their respect for his ability as a warrior was only matched by their concern for his disconnected, even wayward approach to life as one of the Emperor's sons. It is long said that Roboute Guilliman has never fully trusted him. In the time before the heresy, it's been said that Lorgar of the Wordbearers despised him as an untutored savage. Only Horus, among the Primarchs, could truly share an understanding with the Khan, two warriors bound by codes of martial honour, frustrated with the duties and bureaucracy which entangled them. When the scattering of the Primarchs occurred, the child who would become the Khan found themselves upon a world of lush green plains, towering white mountains and black-green seas. At that time, the planet's inhabitants had advanced to a stage where they possessed black powder weaponry and were governed by a well-organised aristocracy. They were led by a figure known as the Palatine, who commanded sizable armies of armoured horse and infantry. To the west of their realm lay the empty Quarter, an unforgiving grassland with meagre resources that remained unconquered. It was inhabited by these nomadic horseman tribes locked in their endless conflicts. The Palatine occasionally led expeditions to capture slaves or engage in skirmishes with these tribes, and the Khan's destiny began to take shape here when he was discovered by Ung Khan, leader of a small tribe, who recognised the young warrior as a gift from the gods due to the fire in his eyes, which they interpreted as signifying his exceptional potential, which was of course undoubtedly very true. The pivotal moment though in the Khan's life came when his father was killed by their rival tribe. Even as a young child, Khan proved himself unsurprisingly to be the tribe's greatest warrior and led a vengeful campaign to eradicate this tribe, leaving no survivors. He mounted the enemy tribe leader's head on his tent, instilling in him a sense of fierce honour, loyalty and ruthlessness. Khan had then vowed to unite the warring tribes and put an end to all these endless conflicts, where one family killed members of another and the conflict simply dragged on endlessly. He fought hundreds of battles against other tribes, even defeating the hunting packs sent by the Palatine. Each tribe they conquered was absorbed into the Talaskars, and he made military service mandatory while splitting tribes up and merging them with others to remove tribal differences, reflecting of course what Guilliman would do many millennia later with the Primaris. The Khan's warriors were fiercely loyal to him, and he promoted from the ranks based on merit and ability. But when a disastrous avalanche swept across the Khan's tribe, he was separated from the others, with his men around him killed, and before he could rejoin them, he was captured by one of the Palatine's hunting parties. But all that returned to the cities of the Palatine from that group was one barely alive mutilated rider carrying with him the head of the son of the Palatine, and a note saying that the people of the steppes were not the Palatine's toys any longer. The Khan had sent about as clear a message as you could, and this was effectively a declaration of war, and inevitably the Palatine launched a formidable army to exterminate the tribes, but in doing so entirely underestimated the Khan's abilities and the tribe's mobility. The tribesmen's relentless arrow assaults decimated the heavily armoured warriors, leading to the army's defeat and massacre that followed. After the battle, the tribal elders declared Khan the Great Khan of the entire land. The Palatine would escape back to his fortress city with his close bodyguards. Thereafter, the Khan embarked on a relentless campaign to conquer the remaining territories on the planet. Cities were given a choice: surrender or face obliteration, again mirroring the Emperor and his unification war. Most chose surrender, but some were razed. When the Khan finally reached the Palatine's palace, his reputation entirely preceded him. The stories of cities being erased from the land who resisted were now well known, and so when Khan audaciously demanded the Palatine's head be brought out and presented to him on a spike, his request was simply fulfilled, and he would display the Palatine's head as a trophy again upon his tent, now vanquishing his greatest enemy. In 2 decades, and notably with an army that was using extremely basic weaponry, Khan had conquered the largest empire in the planet's history, but he now faced the challenge of ruling a people who yearned for their traditional ways. They did not seek empire, vast cities or expansion. and so Khan's people returned to their tribal existence, where he governed them, supported by his trusted generals. A mere 6 months later, the Emperor would arrive, and as the Khan knelt before the Emperor and pledged his service, he would receive command of the 5th Space Marine Legion. Khan worked to integrate the mostly Terran troops into his culture and tactics, whilst also preparing new recruits from his homeworld. But things would not be a smooth integration. The cultural shock of catapulting those from a planet who had before now been an isolated feral world into an age of starships and titanic war machines was an immense challenge. When the Khan returned to Terra, as did all the Primarchs before they were sent out into the galaxy, it was impressed upon him how little time remained before, in the words of Malkador, the doors of fate would become closed. As ever, the Emperor Malkador pushed forward their crusade with an almost reckless panic to complete it according to whatever ticking clock they were clearly concerned by. The Khan was also seen as difficult. His closed-door meetings with the Emperor did not go as smoothly as they may have with others, and when the Khan met with other humans, he was a terrifying figure, rough with his language and aggressive in his manner. Yet he also was considerate to remind and even apologise to those that he came from a world who until recently were fighting with horses, sword and arrows, never having seen any kind of machinery. Now they were standing aboard starships and commanding a legion of super-armoured transhuman soldiers. Yet even these were not as impressive to the Khan as they may have been to others. In fact, the tactics of the Astartes were seen by those from Chagoris as clunky and not particularly impressive, as commented on by the Khan's immediate aides. They noted how the Space Marines invariably relied too heavily on their personal armour to steadily close upon an enemy and then effectively just butcher them as necessary, whereas the warriors who hailed from the Khan's world employed strategies to prioritise speed, manoeuvrability, that they may strike an enemy where they were weakest or fall upon them before they could even prepare any kind of response, to feign an attack, pull back, and then go for the kill. This is what would ultimately develop the White Scar's fundamental battle doctrines, something that they would apply to all of their hardware and war gear. The Khan had a very clear vision on how he was going to run his legion, and certainly no one would tell him otherwise. If that meant that all of their war gear and hardware provided would have to be redesigned, then so be it. To the surprise of none, the reputation of the White Scars during the Crusade mirrored that of his unification war on Chagoris. The Khan found kindred spirits in the likes of Horus and Magnus, powerful, thoughtful individuals who stood apart from their brothers. So it would be a devastating shock to Horus that when the time of the heresy came, the Khan did not stand with the traitors. Horus had felt that Jakati would have been one of the most likely to have joined with him, given the spirit shared between them. But he was a careful figure and not one to be consumed or disorientated by irrational rage or unfounded accusations. When the atrocities of Istvan were reported, the Warhawk held back, understanding that it was critical to determine the specifics of the situation before taking an opinion and a stance. In time, and despite multiple attempts to turn the Khan to the traitors, Jagati noted in conversation with Mortarion that while the Emperor was undoubtedly a tyrant, Horus and his traitors were slaves to the warp. The two fought with the eventual retreat of Mortarion. The coming years saw continual battles between the Scars and the traitors, not to mention the horrors of the warp. Eventually, by means of the Webway, the Khan and the White Scars returned to Terra, where they became embroiled in the frustration of having to accept the defensive strategies of Rogel Dawn and the Imperial Fists, not the fast, aggressive strikeout to the traitors the White Scars or the Space Wolves would advocate for. The Khan, though, was still far more optimistic than many others, and even during the period of the Solar War, the battles which occurred around the Sol system prior to the Siege of Terra, the Khan felt that enough had already been achieved to delay the assault upon Terra, enough so that the Ultramarines would be able to bring in the heavy reinforcements, and that Horus had already failed. Of course, when all was said and done, things came considerably closer to a catastrophic end, certainly closer than Jakati may have anticipated. In one of the most epic battles of the heresy, though, the Khan was nearly slain by Mortarion, and was only able to be saved through the psychic powers of Malkador the Sigillite. It is said that in the aftermath of the heresy, once the Khan finally awakened, he led the White Scars in the time known as the Great Scouring, the time where the Loyalist legions brutalised the traitors and beat them back into the warp maw known as the Eye of Terror. The Khan returned then to Chagoris and found that, like so many sectors of the galaxy, his was rife with Xenos horrors and anarchy. Drukhari raids were even striking Chagoris itself, and an incensed Khan set about rectifying that situation. It is believed that in this campaign, the Drukhari set a despicable trap for the Khan, where a Drukhari prince baited him in battle, following through a webway portal, which immediately then closed behind him. The Scars decimated what remained of the Drukhari upon the world and restored order to the sector, but the Primarch was never seen nor heard from again. Yet with the galaxy in turmoil in M41, the Great Rift, and the return now of 2 other Primarchs, many among the White Scars feel that it is only a matter of time before they are reunited with the Warhawk himself, Jagati Khan. Unlike other Primogenitor chapters, it is said that the White Scars only recruit from their tribes on the homeworld of Chagoris. There are many reasons for this, but much of it is to do with the spirit and character that is developed from living life upon the world, again, very similarly to the Space Wolves. So much of their nature and approach to war as a Space Marine chapter derives from the culture and experience of their tribes. The White Scars believe themselves to carry the lightning of Chagoris in their blood, and that they are the Star Hunt. Their war gear and equipment often contains trophy racks, banners, pennants, golden bells, even scalp poles, and directly mirrors what one would see upon the horseback warriors of Chagoris. Their personal war gear also is often far more individualised and personal than is seen across other chapters of Astartes. Carrying all manner of lance and blade, they sing battle incantations and traditional folk songs. But for all the dressing up, their battle tactics are brutal, fast, disciplined, and highly effective. And despite their displays in battle, White Scars do not strike out of reaction or bloodlust, but with the careful consideration of the hunter or the scout. But once they're committed to an action, they strike with the purpose and ferocity of lightning. The Scars employ a significant level also of autonomy in battle, where squads and sergeants are given the flexibility to alter a strategy as they see fit. Their speed in battle sometimes necessitates this, and the adaptability often catches an enemy off guard, having thought they were able to preempt or understand where the White Scars are attacking from. They will shift defences to counter an oncoming assault or engagement, only to discover that this was in fact a feint, and the White Scars quickly change their position, their tactics, and destroy the enemy. They also have no stubborn or ego-driven sense to grind out a battle, no matter the losses or the shifting situation, like the Imperial Fists. They do not see retreat or the need to yield territory as a weakness or a shame to bear, not entirely dissimilar to the Orcs in some regard. Because they understand that a battle is fluid, there is a need to allow it to even wax and wane, pull back, sometimes allow an enemy to fill a space with their own confidence, and then destroy them with a secondary ambush or pincer assault. How they are seen in that moment by their enemies is irrelevant to the ultimate victory. If anything, a momentary sign of weakness can be a powerful strategy to exploit the overconfidence of the enemy. In this, the Scars are capable of weaving a complex tapestry of war that leaves the enemy confused and often questioning every decision they make. So much so that eventually all order may collapse, leaving nothing other than to slaughter those who remain. They fight in any way necessary, with full access to a powerful range of Imperial hardware, including some of the rarest of war engines and relic armour which have been long held since the time of the Crusade. While the White Scars are obviously known for their fast assaults using bikes, speeders and all manner of craft which allow them to replicate their tactics from the vast plains and grasslands of Chagoris, dreadnoughts are not something which might immediately seem to fit the format of the White Scars. In fact, if anything, they seem to be the last thing any of their number would wish for, even among other chapters, because to be interred within a dreadnought sarcophagus is seen as a horrifying sentence. To be permanently entombed in a claustrophobic robotic tank, never to feel the movement of their own body, the breeze of wind, the feeling of air and rain again. It's a nightmare scenario that leaves many Astartes wishing for a battlefield death rather than a service spanning millennia within a dreadnought. Yet, surprisingly for the White Scars, dreadnoughts are in fact extremely important. those entombed within are looked upon with a sense of pity, certainly, but also one of great honour and respect by other White Scars. For to be placed within a dreadnought is seen by them as, of course, a chance to continue to serve the Emperor, but also to live a selfless life of complete dedication, which in itself automatically demands great respect. But more specifically, their dreadnoughts do not fit easily into the tactics and strategy of battle for the Scars, so they're placed as terrifyingly powerful sentinels who guard the chapter's vault containing their gene seed. The White Scars have seen the devastation that can be caused by degraded or damaged gene seed, and this can be spread to inflict terrible corruption upon their warriors. The Blood Angels, the Imperial Fists, the Space Wolves. All White Scars understand the sacrifice made by the dreadnoughts, and the reasons for the respect demonstrated to them are well understood. But whether their number would fight on the battlefields of M41 or stand as these eternal sentinels, they all will go through an entire ceremony of rebirth, even taking new names for this new life. As for the warriors of Chagoris, they're often seen as terrifyingly wild and undisciplined compared with other chapters of Astartes, something that really couldn't be further from the truth. To some they're seen as barbaric, carrying trophies of dead enemies, screaming into battle with melee weapons brandished, ready to wash the ground with blood. This is their nature, for it is the nature of those who emerge from their homeworld, and this spirit within them is necessary for their very survival. But any who would doubt the battle prowess of the White Scars do so at the prospect of their own inevitable humiliation. For you do not survive 10,000 years and carry a library vault full of victories and endless examples of loyalty to the Imperium and Emperor without knowing how to survive, endure, fight, and bring glory to the halls of their fortress monastery high in the mountains of Chagoris. They understand all too well that no matter the foe, be it Xenos or the great enemy who lies in darkness, there is never one battle tactic or approach that can be victorious, and more important than a toolbox of weapons is the way in which you fight. To be adaptive, and in doing so be fast enough that you can strike before the enemy have a chance to match your movements. This is the way they win, to shift balance, swing around an enemy, strike. Just as the Khan did in his greatest battle on Terra itself, decapitate your enemy before they have a chance to think about a reaction. For 10,000 years, the Imperial Fists chapter and their legion are renowned as the stalwart defenders of the Imperium, and in leading its defiance in the face of abhorrent entities and forces who seek the complete obliteration of human civilization. How the Imperial Fists emerged into the galaxy and what they would later become are defining historical moments of the Imperium and its struggles since the Emperor launched his Great Crusade to reunite all of humanity. Like so many of the Primogenitor chapters, their lineage is drawn all the way back to Terra itself. The Imperial Fists were founded here then as the 7th Legion, and unlike so many of the other legions, the 7th would benefit greatly by being joined by their Primarch Rogel Dawn soon after the Emperor and his Astartes had stepped out into the wider galaxy. This had the result of the Imperial Fists developing along with their Primarch and thereby building a closer bond, not being subjected to the disruptive integrations that would be seen among other legions whose Primarchs joined them much later. Often this would be the case where a force having developed separately to that point was then often painfully having to adjust to the wishes of their newfound Primarch. Because of the speed to which Rogel Dawn was reintegrated with the 7th, their homeworld is in fact listed as Terra itself, except Dawn was raised on the world of Inwit. While this remains a historical point of interest, and the Imperial Fists of course regard it as a world of critical importance to their lineage, from which they continue to recruit, hold ceremonies from and so on, Terra is proudly listed as their homeworld. Because for the Imperial Fists, they consider themselves, even 10,000 years after the heresy, to be the defenders, the sentinels of Holy Terra itself. Even during the period of unification upon Terra, where the 7th first drew their recruits from, they quickly developed shared personality traits that became known to define their number. The 7th Legion and the chapter that followed them were seen to be reserved in speech, to carry an unbreakable sense of pride that some say extends to stubbornness. They were quick in their resolve, reserved in their need to express their thoughts, unless it were warranted. The defining trait of the Imperial Fists was this unbreakable will, but meshed deep beneath all these superficial observations of others was of course a complex and expert mastery of self-control, strategy, discipline, and an overriding commitment to their core purpose. The Imperial Fists have absolutely no tolerance for inefficiency or demonstrating weakness to an enemy. Their stubbornness to some is the purest acceptance of their identity for others. Astartes exist to die in the name of humanity, the Imperium and the Emperor. Space Marines are not created to die from old age or other human weaknesses. The majority, if not all Astartes, will die in battle. Destruction is their nature. They create it, they are consumed by it. This is an inescapable reality that they all should understand. Only the traitors and the heretics would see things from a different perspective to this self-evident truth. The Imperial Fists understand this principle perhaps more fundamentally than others, that they exist as beings of complete self-sacrifice. Their existence is to be that tool of the Emperor, and when they die, they will have completed their service. It is a simple certainty. They aspire to victory, they accept death, but never defeat. They endure the nightmares of the galaxy, they bear the great burden of suffering, because they know that only in death does duty end. In many ways, the Imperial Fists already embodied much of what one of the most famous successor chapters would later become in the Black Templars. The modern chapter of the Imperial Fists continues to recruit from Terra, as we noted, and their Primarch's homeworld of Inwit, but they also draw recruits from other worlds, even hive planets such as the infamous Necromunda. Space Marine chapters can pull recruits from a singular world, but they can equally find new aspirants from all manner of industrial and feral planets, thus keeping a strong diversity among their number who hold a wealth of early life experiences that influence the Astartes that they will become. Only those who can survive the most brutal early experiences have any hope of becoming a Space Marine, and these brutal crucibles of survival are perfect in harvesting new recruits. Necromunda, for example, is a bountiful world for the Imperial Fists, so much so that they even maintain a chapter fortress within Hive Primus to continually search for the raw materials of new chapter aspirants. Because, as with all Space Marine chapters, the trials for aspirants can be brutal. Many die in the process, and the Imperial Fists notoriously employ the use of a piece of technology known as the Pain Glove. Not necessarily for use during trials of aspirants, to be clear, but it's certainly something that could be employed, as it was part of Rigordorn's personal belief that pain burns away impurity and brings clarity to an individual. Many believe that he began to use this in the aftermath of the heresy. Many Imperial Fists will now also use this device, which consists of an all-body electro-mesh sheet to simulate a sensation close to being burned alive, while suppressing the individual's need to pass out or suffer permanent nerve damage. Imperial Fist chaplains refer to this pain as the Crucible of Truth. While also Astartes seek recruits who will be strong in all respects, for the Imperial Fists their greatest trait sought is that of an indomitable will to endure. This is taken to such extremes with the Imperial Fist recruits that they may well be brought to the edge of death before being healed to then go and endure further trials. Should they pass all the mental and physical tests before them, they will become neophytes and begin a new war to survive the process of conversion to an Astartes. This means organ implantation, indoctrination, and extremely intensive training. I've often thought that something which is not immediately a commonly established aspect to the Imperial Fists is that despite their Primarch's homeworld remaining viable, not destroyed during the heresy, and also them maintaining ties with Terra, the Imperial Fists are technically a fleet-based chapter, which is not something immediately apparent. This means that unlike others who maintain a singular fortress monastery upon a world, they operate from a massive fleet who continue to patrol the entire galaxy, travelling to where they are most needed. Of course, fleet chapters, like any other, can still distribute and deploy their forces broadly throughout the galaxy at all times, but for the Imperial Fists, the home of their fleet is known as the Phalanx. This immense and unique ship is a legendary vessel within the history of the Imperium. Although its specific origins and numerous descriptions of how it came to be in service to the Imperium are not entirely clear, it seems true enough that the ship itself, whatever it was originally titled, came to rest above the world of Dawn, Inwit. Its construction logically can be estimated as having taken place during the latter part of the Dark Age of technology, but this ship was broken and heavily damaged, a shell of whatever it had previously been designed for. Dawn, along with tech savants of his world, set upon, obviously, restoring it and repurposing it to their own ends. And Dawn, as with all the Primarchs, was such a master of war that by the time the Emperor discovered the Primarch, the battlecraft now known as the Phalanx carried enough firepower to eclipse even a fleet of Imperial ships. Upon seeing the colossal achievement of Dawn, the Emperor accepted it as the Primarch's gift, only that he might immediately return it, as the new battle station to accommodate the entire Legion of the 7th. Despite many engagements that left it in various states of destruction and now in M41, the Phalanx would never be as powerful as the day Rogel Dawn presented it to the Emperor. But it remains a symbol of the bond between them, and the craft has endured for 10,000 years. It stands as a monument to the achievements and trials of the Imperial Fists, the times where they have come close to destruction, and the battles they have won, which prevented the entire human race from falling to darkness. For the Imperial Fists, if pain is used as a means to purge the soul, bring clarity to the mind, then their use of oaths in ritualistic pre- and post-battle ceremonies wrap the Space Marines in a shroud of commitment, loyalty, and above all else, order. Dawn described the oaths taken by the Imperial Fists to be the bulwark between order and anarchy. Now, the practice of declaring oaths originated in the Crusade. Later, such declarations, among many different Space Marine chapters, would translate to the Holy and Blessed Scriptures, purity seals, honour badges. Their specific purpose has in fact barely altered, although many speculate that, for example, among the Grey Knights, purity seals in fact have a very literal impact on the enemies they fight, and that an individual purity seal offers this real protection against the powers of demons, as the seals can be burned away by the power of the warp but protect the Grey Knight. For ordinary Astartes, oaths of moment, honour seals and so on all originate from a sense of challenge and honour to the Battle Brothers. These would be made as public commitments, oaths of devoted service, and not without some sense of bravado that was common among the Astartes of the Crusades. How many enemy can you kill, and so forth. Later this transitioned to become a pledge and a declaration of loyalty and pure commitment to the Emperor. Such a change of course began to emerge during the transition of the mentality held by Astartes during the Crusade to the time of the Heresy, when things all of a sudden seemed far more serious. One of the best examples is shown to us through the legendary Captain Nathaniel Garrow. While his legion, the Death Guard turned traitor, he swore his company to an oath of moment to carry the warning of Horus's treachery back to Terra and the Emperor, no matter what. Now usually such an oath would be seen and heard by many to hold those making it accountable. So when one of his own, one Solon Decius, noted how could they even make such an oath when there was no third party present to witness it, Garrow replied soberly that the Emperor was watching them. And of course, in Garrow and many others around him, this was really the beginning of the cult of the Emperor, seeing the Emperor as an all-present being who could see you wherever you were at all times. And it really sets a precedent also for the mentality of Astartes going forward from here, where previous commitments were done in a very broad and public way, and as things changed they became more personal, more of the form that would develop within the Imperial Fists. But of course, they're not alone in this practice of oath-making. In the deep heart of the Phalanx is the so-called Temple of Oaths, where Imperial Fist brothers would once make their declarations of duty of endurance and service alone or in the company of others. It was dedicated to holding out the ideals of the Great Crusade, but this has now been sealed for millennia, for none now who are permitted to enter live. Now Imperial Fist brothers make their way to the Cloister of Remembrance, a far more plain and unfurnished space, very differently than the gloriously adorned Temple of Oaths with its battle trophies and honours, much more reminiscent of the Crusades. The final place for the Marines to speak their oaths lies in the Strategium, where chapter officers renew their oaths as they kneel before Rogel Dawn's stasis-held skeletal hand, the only known remnant of the Primarch of the 7th Legion and the Imperial Fist chapter. The Phalanx, despite having suffered considerable damage over the millennia after the heresy, the worst of which was seen during then the fight for Cadia, the Phalanx would emerge victorious in the all-consuming battle which took place there, but eventually limped back to Terra, whereupon it was ordered repaired by Roboute Guilliman himself, and this led to the Custodes opening a vault long sealed containing ancient technology, potentially from the Dark Age of technology, as this would have been the only means of repairing the Phalanx. When the restoration works were complete, the Imperial Fists saw that the Primarch's greatest work was now not only repaired, but there were chambers which had been dark and forgotten for generations, now opened bright and full of life once again. More importantly, cannons and security systems throughout the vessel were renewed, and the Phalanx was once again an exemplary Imperial vessel that outshone all others in M41. As with so many of the core Primogenitor chapters, their defining moments occurred during the Heresy, and the Heresy is of course an immense all-consuming period for the Space Marines, and the details of every event are of course far too heavy to cover until I get into making specific chapter or legion discussions. But the Imperial Fists were already en route to Terra at the behest of the Emperor when Rogral Dawn would become the first loyalist Primarch outside of the Istvan atrocity to learn via the first-hand account of others that some of the legions had turned against the Emperor. But this was a concept so incomprehensible and ludicrous that Dawn nearly killed the messenger where he stood, Nathaniel Garrow, for even daring to suggest that his brother Horus could possibly have become a traitor. It was only with the supporting voices of others that Dawn's rage could be quelled, and he decided that then they must return to Terra to speak with the Emperor and discover if this most impossible of events were indeed true. Dawn would then spend the remainder of the heresy up until the traitors arrived upon Terra, fortifying the Imperial Palace and designing the defensive plans for the Sol System and Terra. The Emperor was occupied with the war in the Webway, and so Dawn himself, in cooperation with the Sigillite, planned the defences of Terra. The warp storm brought upon by the Wordbearers had isolated many other Astartes, most notably the Ultramarines, from being able to travel to the Sol System. And this storm was so severe that at one point Roboute Guilliman already believed Terra potentially lost. As it eventually began to weaken, some of the Primarchs like the Khan and Dawn believed it was now only a matter of time until the legions who were isolated could join them, the Lion, Guilliman, Sanguinis. And so Dawn wanted to then hold the line at the Beta Garman system. What is the Beta Garman system? Well, this was a place which held stable warp routes, allowing entry to the Sol system. This made it strategically important, along with also how intact it had weathered the Age of Strife. It would become, though, a crucible for some of the most intense fighting seen in the Heresy. Entire Titan legions and knight households clashed for supremacy in battles that rendered worlds uninhabitable and ended legacies of honour that stretched back for millennia. It was for the very literal description that the overall battles here became known to history as the Titan Death, and if you want to learn more about that, see the video linked above. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves thought otherwise, of course, and left to confront Horus. When the traitors and Horus finally entered the Sol System, Dawn sent out the Phalanx with himself aboard, but through the treachery of individuals corrupted by chaos, the battle station became plagued by demons who poured from warp portals. Dawn and the Imperial Fists fought a horrific battle with the demon long known as Samus, and was already ready to order the destruction of the Phalanx when the corrupted chose their own death. The portal would close, and as things stood, Dawn ordered the Phalanx to the outer reaches of the system, while he returned to Terra to command the defences of the world for Horus's coming attack. Dawn had been preparing for the traitor's arrival for a long time, and he hated the task he had been given. For every structure he had had to build defences upon, weapons, batteries, reinforced walls, he could only consider how he was making everything the Emperor had created ugly. All the artisan works that humans had travelled and made lifetime pilgrimages to see and create were being covered up beneath his ugly, bland, defensive walls. Dawn's plan had been to overall slowly bleed the traitors as they poured their rage and hatred upon Terra, and hold them at bay long enough for the relief and support of the immense numbers of Astartes that could be deployed by the arrival of the Ultramarines, Guilliman and the Lion. But the plan had to be altered when it was clear that their losses were mounting far more significantly than Dawn had anticipated. He would have to open the Helios Gate to allow Sanguinius of the Blood Angels to lead a counter-attack supported by the Imperial Fists, Solaria and the Imperial Army. Additionally, during the fabled and extremely drawn-out battle for the critical Lionsgate spaceport, the first captain of the Imperial Fists, Sigismund, would be sent out to lead reinforcements and face the traitors by Dawn. But Sigismund was caught in a duel with Khan of the World Eaters, previously a battle brother he considered a friend, and though the two had duelled many times in the past, Khan, so empowered by chaos and the god of blood Khorne, Sigismund would have perished were it not for the intervention of Dawn himself, who battered Khan away easily. He would have to intervene again later when Sigismund was caught facing Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children. The battles and struggles they faced during the Siege of Terra were immense, continual challenges and exhausting horrors. Dawn, it is said, had not slept or taken rest for 3 months since the Siege of Terra began, and things continually worsened despite inspiring efforts from the likes of the Khan. Dawn could see that their defences were steadily collapsing and there was little recourse open to them. This is when, despite it being an obvious trap, an opportunity would present itself, and the Emperor would teleport aboard the Vengeful Spirit, taking with him Dawn, Sanguinius and his Custodes. During this most critical moment, when he teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Dawn had expected to aid the fight against Horus and the traitors. Instead, he found himself lost in a vast, infinite desert, with a singular, infinite wall. Dawn would spend so long here that his mind came close to becoming broken. He could barely even remember who he was. Over time, Chaos attempted to break his will, but who could dare to imagine the will of the Praetorian of Terror could be broken? The horrors of the warp would fail, and I wish I could expand further on this, but we still await the end of Dawn's return during the Siege of Terra. History tells us, though, that eventually Dawn would emerge, for he would be the one to return to Terra, carrying the bodies of Sanguinius and the Emperor. Rogel Dawn would be one of the final living individuals to receive orders from the Emperor. And after the traitors were defeated and began the retreat from Terra, an enraged first captain, Sigismund, began a hunt to track down and kill the sons of Horus' first captain, Ezekiel Abaddon. Despite his efforts, though, his path to Abaddon was always blocked by traitors loyal to the first captain, who then had their lives ended by Sigismund's hands. Sigismund, though, was not deterred by these setbacks and continued his hunt for Abaddon for the next several centuries. Sigismund emerged from the heresy as was already known, a formidable warrior, leading now the zealous faction of the Imperial Fists, who would then later become the Black Templars chapter. Sigismund ascended to lead them with the esteemed position of High Marshal, adopting a personal heraldry marked by black and white, which soon became the official colours of the newly formed chapter, who focused on the more spiritual emerging following to the Emperor. Suspicion surrounded, though, the Imperial Fists and their Primarch Rogel Dawn. In fact, they were even accused of heresy due to their resistance in adopting the Codex Astartes and dividing themselves into smaller chapters. The entire Space Marine structure was fraught with these internal conflicts at the time, but to dispel doubts and reaffirm the Space Marines' loyalty, Sigismund took a decisive step. He proclaimed an eternal crusade, pledging an unwavering pursuit of the Emperor's adversaries, and this act of supreme faith aimed to restore the Space Marines' integrity. So even now, every succeeding High Marshal of the Black Templars has since renewed this oath, and for over 10,000 years, the Black Templars have steadfastly maintained their unbroken crusade against the enemies of the Emperor. All well and good for the Black Templars, but what about the Imperial Fists? Well, as were so many, Dawn was stricken with grief after the Emperor's fall. He could not escape a profound sense of responsibility for the effective demise of the Emperor. In an attempt to atone, similar to the Black Templars in fact, he led his legion on a penitent crusade across the Imperium. However, when summoned back to Terra by Roboute Guilliman's announcement of adopting the Codex Astartes, which involved transforming legions into chapters, Dawn strongly resisted. But he recognised also the potential harm another internal conflict could inflict on the fragile peace of the Imperium. Dawn reluctantly agreed. A degree of controversy surrounds the later events in Rogel Dawn's life, but what is documented is the difficulty they had in dividing the Imperial Fists into chapters, It was a far more challenging task compared to legions like the Ultramarines, as the deep-seated commitment to the legion was ingrained in each Marine, and many were reluctant to establish their own separate chapters. The remaining Imperial Fists Legion was divided into 3 chapters. The Zealous formed the Black Templars, the more rational and newly recruited became the Crimson Fists, and the most devoted to their Primarch remained as the Imperial Fists. Over the next 2 decades, Rogel Dawn dedicated himself to rebuilding and reforming his chapter to align with the standards of the Codex Astartes. Sometime later, though, is when the infamous disappearance of Dawn would occur. After leading an attack on a Chaos fleet, Dawn had identified the strategic importance of striking the enemy while they still prepared. Dawn went missing aboard the despoiler-class battleship Sword of Sacrilege after a desperate attack on its bridge. Only his hand was recovered, preserved by his chapter to this day, and this skeletal fist is housed in a shrine, its bones intricately engraved with the heraldry of all previous chapter masters. Rogel Dawn is officially presumed dead by the Imperium, although his body was never recovered. Many still believe there is as much a chance for his return as there was the Lion or Leman Russ of the Space Wolves. In the contemporary time of M41, the Imperial Fists persist in their mission. Prioritizing the defense of Imperium Sanctus is critical, they believe, but they vehemently refuse to abandon the Imperium Nihilus. The Imperial Fists dismantle tyrants and warlords, teaching them no fortress is impervious, no shelter secure, no weakness too small to exploit. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade is seen by many as proof that had Dawn shaped the fate of the Imperium post-heresy, then the galaxy would be greatly different. Despite embracing the Codex Astartes out of necessity, the Imperial Fists still adhere to its principles, a testament to their refusal to abandon challenges once embraced. To the Imperial Fists, the Indomitus Crusade feels more like the strategy of Dawn than a reborn Guilliman. They are not alone in such assessments, but unlike many who share this perspective, the Sons of Dawn wholeheartedly approve of the change, taking it as confirmation that Dawn's precepts are in ascendance once more, regardless of who is actually issuing the orders. The Ultramarines are surprisingly, at least for me, one of the most difficult Space Marine chapters and legions to speak to. And you may think that sounds ridiculous given the weight of material stored that speaks to their trials and annals. The Ultramarines have, by any measure, the most documentation to their name, covering the involvement in, supporting and defending the Imperium post-heresy, the recovery and ascension of the Primarch Roboute Guilliman, the man who designed the Codex Astartes and which would become the fundamental template for all Astartes chapters, and who now in M41 is the Lord Commander of the Imperium. The Ultramarines then have a very fleshed out character when it comes to them as a legion and chapter. They are also, as many of you will know, my Space Marine chapter, because when I first began my 40k journey, the Ultramarines were the Space Marine force I collected, which often elicits a negative response, as now we see the Ultramarines as the very stock chapter, the bland middle of the road chapter. Except back in the halcyon days of the 2nd edition, the Ultramarines did not receive the blanket coverage they would receive later. They were just one of the Space Marine chapters, no more or less prevalent. What surely did exist even so long ago was still their reputation as being somewhat dull compared to others. They didn't share the dark edge to them as seen with the Blood and Dark Angels. They didn't display the outward ferocity of the Space Wolves, nor the silent, unbreakable and troubling self-sacrificial determination of the Imperial Fists. There was not a focus on speed as seen with the strategic hunters of the White Scars, no selfless nature paired with the masters of wargear seen in the Salamanders. Which brings us to a question I've seen all too often. Just what do the Ultramarines stand for? What is their defining trait, their underpinning agenda as a chapter? What dictates how they fight, how they relate to one another and humanity? Well, I will first lay out the obvious. It's the Codex Astartes, but shortly I'll also tell you my opinion based on a pretty straightforward logical observation. But to begin with, the early history. When the Emperor launched his Great Crusade to reclaim and unite the Empire of Humanity, he also sought the rediscovery of his Primarchs who had been scattered across the stars. The Ultramarines were the 13th Legion, and their Primarch was Roboute Guilliman. Guilliman was luckier than most with the planet his incubation pod landed upon. The world was Macragge, and unlike other Primarchs, he was not dragged into slavery or pitted against death world horrors. Roboute was found by a group of noble huntsmen surrounded by a glowing aura. He was taken to one of the 2 governing consoles of the world and adopted by them. So immediately from an early age, he was brought into society at the highest levels. As with all Primarchs, it was soon clear that this child was not what any would call ordinary. He was a prodigy, both physically and intellectually. He mastered all areas of academia by the wisest scholars on the world whilst still a boy, but his greatest skill was the mastery of military strategy. Often this was paired with the wisdom and restraint of diplomacy. Unlike many of his brothers, slaughtering the enemy to a man was not necessarily the optimal outcome in the eyes of Guilliman, who would very often consider the greater picture than the immediate aftermath. For example, he could return an object stolen from a people to build a new bond with them and gain an ally rather than subjugate an enemy. An interesting detail about his youth, and the sort of detail that falls flat in the face of the usual presentation of life as we see it in the galaxy of M41. And just for the sake of saying it, of course, if we're talking about a Primarch's youth, it's not M41, it's about 10,000 years before that. So when Guilliman discovered his father was close to death after an uprising from his co-consul, the coup was obviously crushed. But after the conspirators were executed, Guilliman ordered their land and wealth redistributed among the populace, rather than held within the higher tiers of power. He went further, and after this would restructure Macragge entirely, where office and honours were given to the most hard-working and those suitable for the role, rather than just the wealthy, the noble, the influential. Effectively, he created what was a meritocracy, literally meaning a society governed by those with the merit to hold positions of power, and Macragge prospered. This sort of governmental structure, of course, was very different than what will be seen throughout the galaxy in M41 after the Imperium was ruled by humanity for such a long period of time. And this meritocratic system is something which Guilliman seems to favour and is potentially even attempting to implement in the Imperium upon his return. Macragge and the systems around it would prosper under the guidance of Guilliman. Ultramar has become one of the largest and most stable territories in the galaxy, with many worlds never having known war or the threat of the Xenos. Many planets are a paradise compared to those on dystopian hive worlds where human lives are worth very little. With the exception of the Lunar Wolves, who would later become the Sons of Horus, no other legion conquered new worlds so successfully under the banner of the Emperor. Guilliman's efficiency was unrivaled, and where some like the Word-Bearers would become bogged down in cultural specifics that they deemed critical to eradicate before world could be left to govern itself, Guilliman would ensure planets were self-sufficient, had an appropriate defense system before moving on, but also leaving advisors to monitor and manage the world to ensure it did not slip back into a state of disruption, potentially leaving some Astartes behind as well. But their primary concern was always the well-being of the population. One of the most contentious events in the Ultramarines' history was, of course, the destruction of Monarchia. The Emperor had discovered that the Word-Bearers Legion were continuing the outlawed practice of considering and spreading the lie of the Emperor's divinity. The Word-Bearers Legion name had been, until their reunification with the Primarch, the Imperial Heralds. They had simply wanted to bring news of the Emperor and his great crusade to worlds as quickly as possible. When they were reunited with Lorgar, their Primarch, who had immediately upon meeting the Emperor believed him to be a god and could not be swayed otherwise, things went very sour quickly for the Legion. So when the Emperor discovered the world of Kur, with its capital city of Monarchia, and that this had been by now heavily indoctrinated by the Word-Bearers, he was incensed. He ordered the Ultramarines to level the city, and publicly humiliated and berated the Word-Bearers. This has always been a contentious event for me personally, as it always seems difficult to understand how the Emperor could not see what would occur in the aftermath of doing this. Although the point seemed accepted by the Word-Bearers, evidently it was not so simple. Something in them was broken after this event, and it began their slow slide into heresy. Remembering that it was really the twisting knife, quite literally, of the word bearers and the words spoken through them into the ear of Horus that caused the heresy. This could be dissected endlessly, and especially by myself, with tangents about free will and overlapping potential futures, but however you look at it, the action of the Ultramarines in destroying Monarchia triggered what would become the heresy. This led to obviously a bitter feud between the Ultramarines and the Wordbearers, and culminated in the horrific Battle of Calth, where the Wordbearers arrived with their fleet alongside the Ultramarines. Guilliman wanted to believe that they could heal their wounds. Sadly, nothing could be further from the truth, and even as the Wordbearers had already begun raining death and destruction upon their brothers, Guilliman still pleaded for sanity before finally being forced to accept that there was no turning back from here. It's one of the most epic events for me in the heresy, and something I want to consider discussing later along the line, as there are so many amazing moments in that story and some of the novellas around it. The Ultramarines would become trapped in an immense warp storm brought into being by the twisted acts of the Wordbearers. This was known as the Ruin Storm, and it was so large that it covered a significant area in the east of the galaxy, so much so that it prevented them from learning even in detail what was happening elsewhere in the galaxy around Terra. Over time, many scattered Astartes from the Blood Angels, Dark Angels, including the Lion and the body of Vulcan and Sanguinius, they would rally together, attempting to figure a path forward and how some of them could return to Terra to find out what was happening and if they were able to aid and defend against the traitors. Guilliman could not know at this point what was happening elsewhere in the galaxy, but he considered it prudent to establish some structure of what was the Imperium here. In the event of a worst case scenario where they could discover later, for example, the full destruction of Terra by the traitors. Guilliman, though, was not Horus. He did not want to crown himself ruler of this Imperium Secundus, and instead he proposed Lionel Johnson rule, who was duly titled the Lord Protector of this new realm. Curiously, just as Guilliman could not know what was happening on Terra, those upon Terra understood that there were still many loyalists stranded out in the galaxy. Malcador the Sigillite even became very concerned that Rabute may be attempting to do something like create a second empire, and that this could bring himself and the Emperor into contention, with Rabute potentially looking to usurp the Emperor if they on Terra were sufficiently weakened. These were the paranoid fears present during the heresy, where no norms existed among the Astartes any longer, and trust was a very difficult thing to come by. It would soon become clear, thanks largely to the visions of Sanguinius, that Terra had indeed survived still, and it was decided that Imperium Secundus should be immediately deconstructed and redacted from all records as ever having existed. The Ruin Storm was weakening, and the Loyalists set out for Terra, but only Sanguinius and the Blood Angels would reach it in time, thanks to the defensive efforts of the Lion and Guilliman. Eventually, the Ultramarines would reach Terra. Reports on long-range communication systems were reporting the 13th Legion had entered the Sol system and were only hours away from Terra. In my opinion, it is still not entirely clear that if in the final hours of the siege upon Terra, just how many of the events which transpired were reactive and which were what we might call fate or destiny. The idea of, was Horus reacting to the appearance of Guilliman? Were they making those decisions? Or at this point, were those concepts entirely out of their hands, even if they appeared to be still making decisions for themselves? It gets very complex when you start thinking to the functionality of chaos and how ingrained they are in the bodies, the spirits of mortals. This again, though, is part of the problem with chaos, and especially the extreme confusion in and around the Siege of Terra, where reality and unreality were overlapping, time becoming an ethereal, unstable force. But it is believed by many that the arrival of Guilliman at the time forced Horus to make a decision, and that he baited then the Emperor to his ship in an attempt to finish the situation before Guilliman could get involved. The Emperor would board the Vengeful Spirit along with Sanguinius, Dawn and the Custodes. The rest, of course, is history, or at least as much as we know so far. After the heresy, the Imperium was decimated. The legions were largely in tatters, and although Horus was destroyed and the Emperor incapacitated, the fighting did not cease. Many traitors fled, many more would fight to their deaths. As they arrived into the apocalypse that was Terra, the Ultramarines were overwhelmed and horrified by what they saw. but they were the largest loyalist legion, as they had been until this point in time, but now this was ever more acutely apparent. Guilliman assumed the title of Lord Commander, and he led the forces now in scouring the traitors from the Imperium. Of course, the other Primarchs led their own campaigns as well against the heretics in their own specific ways. One of the most contentious issues which remained was the fear of the potential threat posed by the immense power of the Astartes legions. This prompted Roboute Guilliman to create the Codex and Adeptus Astartes. Guilliman's Codex Astartes established the default format of Space Marine chapters. Some loyalist Primarchs disagreed, some very strongly, but the looming prospect of conflict brought about the logical yet bitter conclusion that this was the way forward. Progenitor chapters retained their original legion names, while primogenitor chapters created from loyalists post-heresy assumed new titles, examples such as the Aurora chapter, the Emperor's Spears from the Ultramarines, Flesh Tearers, Sons of Sanguinius, and so on. The Codex Astartes is the guiding principle, varied in adherence among chapters, some treated as gospel, others as more suggested guidelines. The Codex was, I believe, Guilliman's way of rationalising the trauma and guilt that had been wrought upon all the loyalists. It was something constructive and substantive for him to attempt to avoid the errors of the past and design a structure that would not easily enable them to occur again. If Guilliman had not been there to prevent the disaster at the end of the heresy, he would ensure that at least it could never take place again. Establishing chapters was challenging, as this required Astartes to start new chapters, often with no prior history or background, something very alien to them after the Crusade and the Heresy's storied history. Many smaller foundings would occur between the second founding and the period of M41 around Guilliman's return. These were instructed as being necessary to maintain the supposed 1,000 active chapters in the Imperium. The accuracy of such figures is always uncertain, and as many as 24 foundings have occurred since the first and second foundings. These chapters often made additional changes, such as for one no longer being on a continuous galaxy-wide crusade, or not being obligated to designate a homeworld. For myself, I have always felt that the Ultramarines are of course a very logical, very formal chapter. They do not add the embellishments or strange practices seen by many on the periphery of the Astartes. They do not adorn themselves in skulls, pelts, trophies of their enemies, for the most part anyway. Much like the Imperial Fists, they're restrained, disciplined and focused on doctrinal excellence. But beyond this, they bear the weight of their past upon their shoulders. There is to me a sadness and a tragedy in their inability to have prevented what was the unmitigated disaster at the end of the heresy. So when I many years ago discovered on one of the Ultramarines banners this simple declaration of "Our presence remakes the past," this to me personally underscores what defines the Ultramarines. While 10,000 years have passed since the end of the heresy, it's clear that their failure to reach Terra deeply scarred them and Roboute Guilliman, even if this was not as outwardly presented as it is in other chapters. The undeniable guilt that consumed them, and the many questions they must have asked themselves in the millennia that followed. No less than it did others, of course, like the Imperial Fists, or the all-consuming trauma felt by the Blood Angels. Could it all have been different had the Ultramarines arrived in time? Would Horus have been defeated and the Emperor lived? Or were these events, as Sanguinius witnessed, inevitable? This declaration of "Our presence remakes the past" carried upon a banner of an Ultramarine bearing a banner which suggests that the words upon it are not necessarily applicable to the situation depicted, that being of the victory of the Tyranids at Macragge, but it can relate to both. To me though, this is essentially saying that they cannot change what has already transpired. History is what it is, nothing can change that now. But they, by simply existing, doing their duty and resisting all the horrors of the galaxy from consuming the Imperium, helps, in their minds, redress the balance. The achievements of the Ultramarines since the end of the heresy have all been in service, of course, to the Imperium, a task they should be performing already. But I think it's also to make up for their own failure in that time, to attempt to remake, as I say, perhaps even if it's at least just in their minds, for the past, through their presence in the contemporary Imperium. And this is of course all just my personal opinion. It's an outlook that I enjoy to apply to the Ultramarines because I do think it fits their nature, and the very real guilt felt by them in the aftermath of the heresy. It adds a touch of frustration, sadness, determination to what are otherwise one of the more plain, or we could say difficult to read, chapters of Astartes. Because as Ultramarines, they could not vent their frustrations with rage or zealous crusades of purging that leaned heavily on the new religion of the Imperium. They had to remain as the Codex instructed, restrained, disciplined, focused on their duty and priorities. They had to remain leaders. One aspect of the Ultramarines Legion that survived their second founding was the close relationship between the Space Marines and the populations of the surrounding planets. During the Great Crusade, the worlds around Macragge provided recruits for the Ultramarines. They also supplied raw materials, armaments and spacecraft. These traditions have continued ever since to this day, and the Ultramarines recruit not from a single world, but from the entirety of the area around Macragge. This region of space is vast and sprawling, and is known as Ultramar, the Empire of the Ultramarines. Ultramar is unique amongst the domains of the Space Marines because it encompasses an entire subsector of Imperial space, including many star systems, each with its own worlds and governments loyal to the chapter. All the worlds of Ultramar share a common cultural heritage with Macragge, so it is not surprising that their styles of architecture, government and tradition are similar. Using those meritocratic governmental systems set in place by Roboute Guilliman, the citizens of Ultramar are disciplined, productive and loyal. As a result, Ultramar has become a wealthy empire that has known little unrest or rebellion for long stretches of time, a unique distinction in the war-ridden galaxy. The most heavily populated of Ultramar's worlds are entirely self-sufficient, which is again unusual for the Imperium. There's often much trade flowing between one planet and the next. Ultramar has long maintained its own battle fleet of Imperial Navy warships, controlling void power that rivals many of the Imperium's greatest armadas. Furthermore, the Ultramar Defense Auxiliae, tithed and raised from the worlds of Ultramar, just as normal Astra Militarum regiments are tithed from independently governed worlds. They can marshal many billions of men and women under arms. They have a garrison presence on every world in Ultramar and are as well trained, well drilled and well equipped as would be expected of the Ultramarines' human auxiliaries. This is not to suggest that Ultramar has never faced dire threats. Tendrils of several Tyranid hive fleets had sought to penetrate its defences with varying degrees of success. The arsonist of Charadon, one of the greatest orc warlords in the galaxy, led a war from his anarchic domain to overrun the Ultramarines' easternmost defences. And most terrible of all, of course, is the threat from Chaos, and that peril has only increased since the opening of the Great Rift. Ultramar is a realm always beleaguered, beset on all sides, yet it still stands defiant and unusually idealistic to live in compared with much of the Imperium. Like so many of the Primarchs, Guilliman would be taken out of the picture for the next 10,000 years effectively, but before doing so he instructed the tech priest Belisarius Cawl with two tasks. Firstly, his resurrection should he fall, and the second to create and improve upon the Space Marines of the Emperor. Soon after this, Guilliman's fears would be realised when he was terminally wounded by Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, stabbing Guilliman through the neck with a poisoned demon sword. Roboute was close to death. His apothecaries would not accept this, and so placed him into a stasis field where he remained in this state of perpetual near death until somewhere in M41. After Cadia fell, a strange collective of individuals, including Xenos of the Eldari, Saint Celestine of the Sororitas and Belisarius Cawl of the Mechanicus, would, through, by Imperial standards, highly questionable means, resurrect Guilliman and place him into a specially designed unique suit of power armour created by Cawl, known as the Armour of Fate. This armour can never be removed from Guilliman as it continues to keep him alive. Guilliman had returned to the Imperium, but he was appalled at the state of it. All he could see were cults and worshippers of mythic practices, degenerate governors out for themselves, and those who placed the Emperor as a god. He watched horrified as these religious worshippers would burn those and torture those that they considered heretics on the slightest pretext. The general state of the Imperium was in extreme decay. He barely even recognised his own Astartes. Guilliman was miserable and disgusted. He travelled to Terra to see the Emperor upon the Golden Throne, but even this journey was not easy, as his return had sparked a rage in the warp, and the gods therein who threw many obstacles in his path. so much so that his journey became known as the Terran Crusade. This culminated in a battle between Guilliman and Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, upon Luna in orbit around Terra. And almost unbelievably, soon after he had returned, Guilliman was nearly felled by Magnus. It was only with thanks to the reinforcements of the Sisters of Silence they weakened the psychic power of Magnus enough that it enabled Guilliman to impale Magnus, banishing him back into the webway. Guilliman was finally granted an audience with the Emperor upon Terra alongside the Captain General of the Custodes. No one knows exactly what took place between the Emperor and Guilliman. But Guilliman seemed deeply troubled by the experience. He had perhaps thought that this would be reassuring, give him some guidance, some strength. He had clearly realised the time he had spent now with the Emperor was not the being or the man he recalled from his time during the Crusade. But whatever took place, when Guilliman emerged, he seemed both shaken from his depressive state, looking at now what had happened to the Imperium. He quickly could see the corruption and poor functionality of the High Lords of Terra, and so simply declared the Imperium would be reorganised under his leadership. He declared himself the Lord Commander of the Imperium once again. None could question his authority. He later would go on even to declare himself the living hand of the Emperor, the Imperial Regent. Not unexpectedly, Guilliman would move very quickly, reorganising and equipping the Imperial armies, bringing into the open the existence of Call's immense great work, the Primaris Marines, and sweeping civic reforms, for which he penned a new Codex Imperialis. Unlike the Codex Astartes, which he also believed needed revisions, but which had always focused purely on military organisation, the Codex Imperialis was to be a civic document focusing on the reorganisation of the imperial governments. In addition, he also wanted this to be the first reliable history of the Imperium in 10,000 years. And if you want to know more details in and around this, look to my video for the Chronostrife for more on that. But one major problem for Guilliman in the contemporary time is the issue of the imperial religion. Guilliman comes from a time where the very concept of worshipping the emperor or any being as a deity was a crime if not a death sentence. So to return to the Imperium, where almost every world is consumed by religious worship of the emperor, and entire factions such as the Sororitas exist led by their faith, it was more than a little jarring to Guilliman. Obviously though, Guilliman is not stupid. He understands that he cannot just declare the ecclesiarchy an enemy of the state. This would undoubtedly cause a second civil war in the Imperium, perhaps far worse than ever seen in the heresy. Strangely though, Guilliman, after witnessing several instances of individuals exhibiting powers that one could certainly explain as appearing miraculous, has begun to explore the possibility of what worship and faith could mean. He still considers it ridiculous, but there is a curiosity in Guilliman that has not yet reached a conclusion. Currently, he wages on with his Indomitus crusade, seeking to reach the other side of the Great Rift that has split the galaxy apart, and left much of the Imperium in darkness, isolated and at significant risk of destruction by Xenos and Chaos. As with all the chapters, there is significantly more to look at in terms of their structure. Individuals of note like Sicarius or Oriel Ventress, these will be addressed in later chapter-specific explorations. But for now, the continued presence of the Ultramarines will remake the past. The Space Wolves are one of the most unique of contemporary Space Marine chapters in M41, not least because the term chapter is somewhat questionable when it comes to the Space Wolves. We'll come to that. But they are one of the most misunderstood of Space Marine chapters in all regards. Terrifying and fierce at first glance, but fair, honourable, even noble in spirit and conduct. Unlike others who at least pay some lip service to the Codex Astartes, even if they do not fully agree with it, the Space Wolves do not adhere to the teachings of Guilliman in any form. They have remained perhaps the most pure chapter in terms of their spirit since the heresy. Where others allowed their legions to be divided and fragmented, the Space Wolves strongly resisted this. Their Primarch Leman Russ strongly disagreed with Guilliman's plans to divide the legions, and while eventually Russ was talked around on the matter, and while the Space Wolves appeared to remain compliant in this respect, it's an open question as to just how many Space Wolves Astartes exist within the chapter. They are, after all as well, one of the only chapters who effectively have no successor chapters. Space Marine chapters are very often spread all around the galaxy, and Astartes rarely get involved in conducting any kind of monitoring upon one another, certainly not in a sense of looking into their records for numbers of Marines and so on. Technically, the Inquisition could take on this task, but it's really unheard of. The Space Wolves divide themselves into 12 great companies, but the number of Marines within these companies is again not particularly apparent. In fact, it seems to change constantly dependent on the specific threats or operations they're conducting, which leaves many to suspect that at certain times their numbers appear more standard comparative to other chapters, and at other times considerably more. It's commonly noted though that their companies of Space Marines are significantly larger than is seen among even other chapters. Unlike other chapters, the Space Wolves also operate a curious hierarchy within their chain of command that allows for far more autonomy. Like many Space Marine legions or chapters, their structure originates from their Primarch's homeworld of Fenris. Based upon the tribes of this frozen world, each great company leader bears the title of Jarl, or the Wolf Lord. These lords are aided by the Thanes and others who all come under the banner of Wolfgod. Importantly though, the leader of the Space Wolves, similar to a chapter master, is known as the Great Wolf. They do not sit though as a floating entity, and they will command the leading great company themselves. However, unlike other chapters, the Great Wolf does not lead the Space Wolves directly. He must operate his command through the Council of Wolf Lords, who each lead the great companies. This structure though is generally a formality, as all lords must show fealty to the Great Wolf, but technically they have the authority to reject his requests should they wish to do so. This is uncommon, but has happened in the history of the Space Wolves, just as Leman Russ himself did not conform to the leadership of the Lord Commander in the aftermath of the heresy or during the heresy. The Space Wolves believe strongly in the will of fate itself, that essentially what will be, and to this end, if they feel the need to strike out on a campaign independently, they may well do so. Whole great companies have taken extended periods of time away from the Council in such operations, and may even be gone for so long that when they return they may find a new great company has taken their place, for they were considered lost or destroyed. This obviously can pose a problem of reintegration, and if two Wolf Lords cannot agree on who will lead the company, some challenge will be issued, a contest of strength, wills, or some other design. But rarely will these lead to the death of a lord, because they're merely a test designed to allow the structure of the company to be reformed appropriately. In some instances, even a drinking competition is enough to settle the matter. But this fluid restructuring that can occur is perhaps one reason that conducting any sort of count of Space Wolves at one time or another is very difficult, and this is very likely an intentional feature of the Space Wolves chapter, designed to allow them more considerable strength than other chapters, but keep it shrouded behind a fog of flexibility. Additionally, there was once a 13th Great Company, but the reasons for its disappearance are unknown. Some state that they disappeared into the warp during the attack on Prospero, the traitor homeworld of the Thousand Suns, during the heresy, but it's also been speculated that they followed their Primarch Leman Russ around the time he disappeared. But few would dare to whisper the possibility that they somehow became corrupted and had to be permanently destroyed. Little if any information concerning the company exists within the Imperial records, and unusually compared to other great companies, they have not been replaced by additional new recruits. While the Space Wolves would always fight together if need be, each great company is very much a distinct, self-contained fighting unit. They have everything they need to fight, independent from the others, and while individual Astartes very rarely move between companies, equipment and hardware can be transferred as necessary. Overall, the Space Wolves function far more like some kind of feudal system than a disciplined military chain of command, as seen in others like the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists. They rely on oaths, pledges, obligations to the other company lords and the Great Wolf. Of course, they continue to keep the interests of the Imperium and the Emperor in their heart, but they rarely seem to follow the orders of other factions and administrative bodies within the Imperium unless they clearly agree with the necessity of the request. When it comes to the term chapter, this is something that they would openly joke about with one another. that this term is a theoretical Imperial concept and not something they really care to pay so much attention to in reality. Because in all honesty, who is going to step up and force the Space Wolves to conform to these restrictions? That is a battle that is simply not worth having. But this dismissive, borderline mockery of the Codex is seen throughout the Space Wolves. In all respects, they continue to conduct themselves with little difference than they did as a Legion, but they have clearly made some minimal efforts to adjust to prevent things from becoming a bigger problem than it needs to be, even for themselves. Their attitude towards the more formal nature seen in most Space Marine chapters is just tolerated within the Imperium and the Adeptus Astartes. They do not have a Librarius, for example, but instead employ rune priests who draw the powers of cold and earth from their homeworld. Their Tech Marines, unlike most who learn their trade upon Mars, gather most of their knowledge from the cults and forges on the homeworld. They do not even speak the language of the Imperium by default, preferring to use that of their homeworld, known as Hearthcant. The Astartes of what was once the 6th Legion do not even refer to themselves as the Space Wolves chapter. They refer to themselves as the Wolves of Fenris, ambiguous enough to walk the line between calling themselves still the Legion of the Space Wolves. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, like all the Primarchs, came to find himself upon a world that had not been his intended home. Yet curiously, it's difficult to imagine the Primarchs having originated anywhere else. What characters would they have been had they found themselves elsewhere? The Primarch who would become Leman Russ found himself upon the world of Fenris, not just an inhospitable frozen planet, an imperial death world. These do not support widespread human settlement due to the environmental conditions or the hostility of the fauna and flora upon a world. Sometimes, though, these planets produce expert members of the Imperial Guard who are tempered by such extreme conditions, even though the rate of attrition for new recruits is very high. The Primarch of the 6th found himself in his incubation pod upon Fenris. An ordinary child would have perished soon after being exposed to the harsh conditions, but not the Primarchs. Russ was aided, but not by humans. Instead, he was discovered by a native Thunderwolf, a terrifying creature who sensed in him a feral spirit, and did not kill the young Russ outright, but sheltered him and raised him. Later, when a hunting group of humans from a local tribe confronted the wolf pack, they tragically killed the mother wolf and many of her still young cubs. An enraged Russ fought with a fury they'd never seen anything before or since, and slaughtered many of the hunters in an attempt to protect his remaining packmates. But the hunters then saw to their shock that this in fact was not a wolf of the pack, but a human boy. After a standoff where Russ began to become aware that they may not be his enemy, he was brought before the king of the tribe, where he would be raised as a Fenrisian warrior. As is typical with the stories of the Primarchs, after learning the ways of his world, he would rise to become the king or the authority of the world, so that when the Emperor's crusade arrived, it was very clear who this Wolf King must be. But the Emperor, also knowing the character of his Primarchs, knew that Russ would never accept him as the master of mankind without demonstrating his clear power and authority. The Emperor then allowed Russ to choose the challenges, but it would only be on the third trial, when Russ challenged him to combat, that the Emperor demonstrated he was the one true master of mankind, felling Russ with a single blow from his powered glove. The Primarch of the Space Wolves had to accept that this was his father, the Emperor of mankind. The Space Wolves fought many battles during the Crusade and Heresy. They purged many worlds of the traitors, including those of the Death Guard, the Alpha Legion forces, not to mention of course the devastation wrought upon Prospero and the Thousand Sons. They gained something of a reputation as the Emperor's executioners. It was even rumoured they may have been responsible for whatever fate befell those lost Space Marine legions. In actuality, though, this phrasing seems something of an exaggeration. When we think of the other Space Marine legions, few seem to have much issue following the Emperor's orders when it comes to wholesale annihilation. Admittedly, the Space Wolves do seem to have had more of a place when it came to engaging other Astartes, but there's no real reason why they specifically should befit this role. They are as aggressive and as single-minded and apathetic to the acts as any others. The only difference may be the manner in which the Space Wolves approach such a task. while other Astartes make careful plans, consider all possibilities, design a scheme which involves the destruction of resources, blockades of fleets steadily to choke their foe. By the time all of this has been assessed, the Space Wolves would be upon the enemy like the bloodthirsty wolves of Fenris, teeth bared, heading straight for the throat. So it may simply be the directness of their approach which differentiates them in the mind of the Emperor. Despite the rumours and the speculation, no one knows what happened to Leman Russ. The aftermath of the heresy was a chaotic time that continued the bloodshed and war that had plagued the Imperium. Many loyalists went on missions of scouring, blinded by the trauma and rage of such a hollow victory, and one that had cost the Emperor so much. Many Astartes went off on these individual quests, never to return. Russ himself disappeared around 2 centuries after the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. He left the Great Hall after seeming to be struck by some moment as if caught in a vision. He spoke nothing to those in attendance and disappeared accompanied by his wolf guard, never to be seen again. The Space Wolves, of course, did not accept his disappearance as being permanent. They have sought their Primarch for 10,000 years. They searched all throughout the galaxy, but returned to Fenris again and again with little more than tales of their deeds and battles fought. Bjorn, the youngest of Russ's Wolf Guard, and the only that he had left behind, led a force into the Eye of Terror itself and the Warp, but was mortally wounded and would be placed into a dreadnought where he still exists to this day as the oldest dreadnought in the entire Imperium. The second of these great hunts for the Primarch saw them return troublingly with the armour of Russ. This was discovered in the Temple of Horus on a world known as Rudra, near to the Eye of Terror. This disturbing discovery did not dissuade the Space Wolves, and they have continued their hunts throughout the millennia. Sometimes the rune priests would tell of Russ imparting his wisdom to them, something which sparked hope and new quests in the Astartes. All that is known today is that Russ has assured his sons that he will return in what is referred to as the Wolf Time. This is when the Imperium will fight its final battle against Chaos and potentially see the Emperor rise once again. Many believe that that time is fast approaching, as the great rift that has torn through the galaxy is making the likelihood of such an apocalyptic battle ever more likely. Although the Space Wolves resisted their formal restructuring by the Codex Astartes in Guilliman, they were divided, and in the second founding the chapter known as the Wolf Brothers were created. However, the swift degradation of their genetic viability quickly made it clear that further division of the Space Wolves would be almost impossible. Now, I would not be the person to ever suggest that it could be possible that in this instance it was a deliberate act somehow by the Space Wolves to prevent any further questions about their lack of restructuring compared to other Progenitors. I wouldn't suggest that, but others of course may well do. In the contemporary Imperium though, there was nowhere left to hide for the Space Wolves and their resistance to Guilliman. Belisarius Cawl was successful enough in stabilising the gene seed for those lines of Astartes that many new chapters could be created. Still, while Guilliman did create new unnumbered sons of Russ, he had enough sense to only do so in small numbers, not to draw too much ire from Logan Grimnar, the current Great Wolf and oldest chapter master in the Imperium. Guilliman is nothing if not a master of diplomacy, and he well understood the best way to continue to create a strong bond between the Imperium and the Wolves of Fenris was in turning the new Astartes over to the Great Wolf and urging him to reinforce his chapter as well as to raise new ones. The Space Wolves exist both part and apart from the Imperium and humanity. They represent some of its most brutal and noble qualities. In the darkening end times of M41 upon Fenris and all across the galaxy, Space Wolves' rune priests receive cryptic visions. Time and again, their casting of bones point to the same future: the return of the 13th Great Company, the emergence of Magnus and Rabute Guilliman. These they believe to be the last verses of the saga that will culminate in the Wolf Time. One of their greatest rune priests and librarians across the entire Imperium, Njal Stormcaller, petitions Logan Grimnar to awaken from stasis beyond the Fell-Handed, so that the ancient warrior may grant the High Rune Priest an urgent audience. The request is granted, though what they speak of is kept secret. As I noted from the start, this series for me was a means to mentally get a foot on a ladder of looking into the Astartes chapters and their history. As I pored over the histories of the White Scars, the Imperial Fists, the Ultramarines, the Space Wolves, it is honestly always beneficial to remind yourself of so much of the core basics. It just creates a clearer picture in the mind. As I said at the beginning, the purpose for this series is to then begin the deeper dives into these chapters, for there is so much more detail to rake over and consider. I think some of those could be overviews, maybe some that were focused on characters could be individual. Many of you are often asking me to continue my character-focused Legend series, which would fit very well into the remit of exploring Space Marine chapters, and that need not be in any specific order either. But I think for myself mentally, I needed to get these overviews out of the way first, because it then opens up other things as being possible in my mind. My main question today though, is after this video, do we go straight into the traitor legions, or do we cover the Custodes to bridge the gap? I personally feel the latter. It seems long overdue, but please, as always, tell me in the comments below. Also, which Space Marine characters of Legend or Primarchs do you most want me to overview? Try to upvote comments because I'll likely look at the highest to do first. As things stand in M41, the Imperium remains divided. Roboute Guilliman and now Lionel Johnson have returned to lead humanity. The Mechanicus have provided the Astartes with new flesh and the material to fight back against the traitors and the nightmares that pour forth from the warp and the Great Rift. But nothing is certain. The galaxy burns. Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilis are besieged worlds, and entire systems are ravaged by war. The soldiers of humanity are spread thinly. Lines break. Stands made. Worlds hold out in the hope of relief. The spirit of humanity cannot easily be extinguished, and rumours continue to swirl around the Emperor himself. Psykers and the Rift are whispered to be empowering the master of mankind, but few dare to even speculate about what this could mean. I will return soon with, I hope, some more consumable sized videos. Rogue Trader is also on the horizon. There's also the possibility of some loot in Necropolis nearby. As always, I greatly appreciate your support here on the channel. For those of you who enjoy it, even just for sleep, for those who are painting right now, or anyone new to 40k. Thanks to you all. Please remember to like the videos, as this greatly helps the stability and growth of the channel. Leave a comment if you can. All socials on my Patreon below this video. The transition from the heresy to the Codex Astartes was a difficult one. Many of the loyalists felt broken, mentally ruined in the aftermath of the heresy. But today I think we will summarise with the inspiring words of the great Khan, who said that there is more under the arch of heaven than victory and defeat. We may fall back, but not forever. We may faint and we may weave, but not forever. We may yet be doomed to lose all we cherish, but we shall do so in the knowledge that we could have turned away and did not. We remained true. They can never have this, not if they burn all we ever built and scorn us through the dancing flames. You hear me? We remained true.